When it comes to doctors, there is a great deal of confusion about not only what makes a good doctor, but who is a doctor. In 2017, Politico declared that Bill Gates was the world's most powerful doctor. That's strange because here in New Zealand, the medical authorities alleged that I shouldn't be allowed to publicly voice my opinion on COVID-19, despite being a qualified doctor. On the other hand, Bill can apparently dictate health policy to the world with no medical credentials whatsoever. However, it's not just in recent times that the establishment cartel has tried to dictate who is allowed to play doctor. In the middle of last century, a New Zealand surgeon was suddenly struck with the realization that 95% of allopathic medicine was wrong. He started treating patients with a whole new paradigm, and not surprisingly, the medical authorities spat the dummy. But he didn't care for their dogma, and as his reputation grew, people travelled from far and wide to see New Zealand's greatest doctor. New Zealand's Greatest Doctor is actually the name of a book. The full title is New Zealand's Greatest Doctor, Ulrich Williams of Wanganui, a surgeon who became a naturopath. It was first published in 1998 by Brenda Sampson, and we are indebted to her foresight in documenting the story of a doctor that the medical system finds inconvenient. Brenda was in her 20s in the 1940s and suffered from crippling arthritis. She was given a grim prognosis from the medical establishment, who recommended manipulation under anaesthetic and gold injections. However, her singing teacher mentioned that if it was a cure she was after, then she needed to see Dr. Ulrich Williams. Dr. Williams was running several convalescence homes in Wanganui, so Brenda arranged for a 2-week stay that would in fact end up being 2 months long. When Dr. Williams walked in to see her for the first time, his words were, "The world is a beautiful and wonderful place. If you don't see it that way, you are looking at it upside down." The routine she was prescribed in the home was simple and natural. Raw fruit, raw milk, citrus drinks, vegetables, eggs, fish, meat twice a week, and homemade scones in the evening. Exercise was strongly encouraged, particularly walking. On weekdays, Dr. Williams would speak to all his patients for an hour about healing. He would explain that all disease comes from one of two places, either an unhealthy way of life with poor diet, drinking and smoking, lack of exercise, or else it comes from unhappiness in the mind and spirit. If a person is very unhappy and can't find a way out of the unhappiness, the body will create a way out through illness. He would then go on to say, "You cannot hope to be healed unless you throw out all fear and resentment." Dr. Williams was a believer in healing by faith, but would also say, "I try not to use the word God. People have so many misconceptions about this word that it is a barrier to communication. I try instead to use the words life and the life force. Life will bring you everything good as long as you trust it." He was also fond of saying, "We have so much. How can we be resentful?" Brenda was inspired by his talks and noted that Dr. Williams was not inclined to perform many physical examinations or run tests on his patients. However, she had been in the home for almost 2 months and was still in pain. She recalls that she was anxiously hobbling along the roadside when Dr. Williams passed by in a car. The next time he spoke with her, he simply said, "You'll have to pull up your socks." It was these few words that made Brenda realise she was still holding on to fear. She knew she had to let go of it, so said to herself, "All is well." She repeated it again, and within days noticed that her pains were disappearing. She thanked Dr. Williams for curing her, to which he replied, "I didn't cure you, only God can heal. Actually what I did was to teach you how to cure yourself, and that will be useful to you all your life." Ulrich Williams was born in Wanganui, New Zealand on May 22, 1890. He was described as a handsome and athletic young man and held the amateur record for several major golf courses. He attended medical school at Edinburgh University in Scotland and then returned to New Zealand to build up a successful practice as an obstetrician and surgeon. However, in 1931, at the age of about 40, he felt something was dreadfully wrong with his life and even contemplated suicide. Around this time he went to spectate at an open-air meeting for unemployed men in Cook's Garden and heard Archdeacon Jim Young say, "If there is any man here who feels absolutely at the end of his tether and does not know what to do to make his life tolerable, my advice to him is, go home, go into your room, shut the door, kneel down, and simply put your hand into the hand of Jesus Christ and ask him to direct your life from now on." This was the turning point in Dr. Williams' life, and he embraced this advice to accept the power and guidance of the divine. Up to this point, he had a reputation of being a playboy doctor, more interested in sports, women, and booze than his patients. As one friend put it, he would, quote, rush them through the surgery, filling them up with sedatives and drugs just as quickly as he could, so that he might have more time for his pleasures. However, one night when he was alone in his surgery, he heard a clear voice speak to him and say, "Are you not ashamed of yourself?" He knew it was time to find a new path, and over the next few years gradually worked out his basis for healthy living: right eating, right thinking, and right living with an appreciation of the relationship between body, mind, and spirit. He became appalled at the number of operations being done on people and resolved to do no more surgery himself. He made detailed studies on the processing of food, the health and methods of fertilization of the soil, diet, and psychology. He concluded that the excessive use of chemical pesticides and fertilizers were endangering human health. In this regard, he was years ahead of even Rachel Carson, who blew the whistle on DDT and other environmental chemical contaminants in the 1960s. On that note, we cover chemical contamination and the link to diseases such as polio in more detail in our book Mania. One of Dr. Williams' main treatments revolved around diet, as Brenda Sampson outlined earlier. He advocated largely uncooked diets and had no time for processed foods. Raw cow's milk featured prominently as he believed that milk was ruined by pasteurization and other treatments. His stomach ulcer patients were put on raw milk for up to 3 months. With regard to raw milk, don't forget to check out my article and video if you haven't seen that already. A typical dietary prescription for his patients was as follows. Breakfast: 2 grated apples, a level tablespoon each of honey and raw oatmeal, juice of half an orange, 3 tablespoons of cream-rich milk, and a handful of raisins or nuts. Lunch: wholemeal bread, butter, honey, salad vegetables, a hard-boiled egg, cheese, and walnuts. On cold days, this was substituted with a homemade soup. Mid-afternoon: carrot juice, sipped. Evening meal: meat or fish with plenty of steamed vegetables. Dessert: stewed fruit or ripe fresh fruit. Alternatively, a baked custard or a steamed pudding. For many conditions, Dr. Williams would advise that the only cure would be through fasting. He would say, man is the only animal that hasn't got enough sense to stop eating when he is sick. His advice to patients was that they could take plenty of water, citrus juices, and vitamin C, and sometimes raw milk and apples depending on the ailment. The period of time required for this type of fast could range from 7 days to a few months. Dr. Williams' manner could take some of his new patients by surprise. One such patient, a Colonel Harry Coffin from Sydney, Australia, described the state he was in before consulting Dr. Williams. The Colonel had chronic eczema of both legs and had been under leading dermatologists for 2 years without improvement. He only had one interview with Dr. Williams, who took him to task right away. He recounted, quote, "As a Christian, I should be ashamed to be in the condition that I was in, which he said was due to me breaking the law of God. He said that if the poisons in my body had not broken out through the skin, I could well have been crippled up with arthritis. I should be thanking God rather than being sorry for myself." He was prescribed an eliminative diet, exercise, a daily enema, and no more drugs or lotions. Within 6 weeks, the eczema was completely cured. The Colonel wrote to Dr. Williams for his account, but the response was simply to thank God, and that payment would be by serving others with his recovered health. This was typical of Dr. Williams, who rarely billed his patients and simply requested that they follow the law of God. Ulrich Williams had some dynamite quotes and one-liners that I wanted to share with you. In one magazine article he said, "Doctors are disease mongers and churches sin factories. Patients are put through the doctor's hands by the hundreds, the doctor collecting from them all the time. They are no better than the ministers who are always harping on about sin and saying you must come to our church and receive our ceremony or our salvation, and you pay as you come in." Some of his other quotes included, "Healing comes to those who want health, to use it for right, not just for their own selfish ends. Faith is like posting a letter. You expect it to be delivered so you forget about it. You don't sit and worry whether it will be delivered. Everything begins first on the spiritual plane, then becomes mental, then becomes physical. There are 500,000 sick people in New Zealand. The thoughtful may well ask, why don't the doctors cure them? And the answer is, not only do orthodox methods not cure disease, but in too many instances they aggravate or actually cause disease and prevent recovery. No disease is incurable, but some patients are because they don't want to change. They go down to death like sheep in a slaughter race, just because they will not change. I never became a real doctor until I forgot 95% of what I learnt at Edinburgh." Not only was Dr. Williams awake to the problems of the medical system, but also to the corrupt financial system. In one article, he commented that the Great Depression had been deliberately inflicted by those who controlled world finance. He urged people to be aware of this and was an advocate for decentralization of the global financial system. However, it was of course his medical opinions that brought him into the biggest conflicts with the establishment. In 1936, he was warned by two medical businessmen that he was going to be framed by the British Medical Association. In a staged campaign, 22 doctors gave, quote, evidence in the form of personal attacks against Dr. Williams without actually refuting his methods. As he said, "A good way of discrediting inconvenient teachings is to discredit the teacher." In other words, if Dr. Williams was alive today, the mainstream media and fact-checkers would no doubt be running a smear campaign against him. Due to a lack of genuine evidence against him, the Medical Association charged him with, quote, infamous conduct in a professional respect. This really struck a chord with me, as apparently the henchmen at the New Zealand Medical Council were trying to pin a similar charge on me as well, so it looks like I'm in good company. The authorities weren't finished with him though, and in 1947 the Medical Council attempted to get him struck off for alleged, quote, grave impropriety in a professional respect. However, as stated in a history of the Medical Council of New Zealand, the Attorney General ruled against this, as the court would be obliged to find the facts of the case did not constitute grave impropriety or infamous conduct. Hence, Dr. Williams remained on the register and continued practicing for many years after this. My only criticism would be that he elected to stay on the register after realising that medical boards are tyrannical about upholding industry dogma, rather than having anything to do with promoting good health. In fact, in one article he wrote, "The modern medical system, to the extent of perhaps 80%, is nothing but a gigantic, cruel, ludicrous, lucrative, transparent fraud. Doctors do not know what disease is, nor how it is brought about. Doctors, completely unaware of their significance or purpose, are taught that acute illnesses are acute diseases, which they must prevent or cure. With this object, they employ a battery of destructive agents, notoriously more dangerous than the ills they are supposed to cure. Poisonous drugs, vaccines, radiation, and mutilating surgery are their weapons. Perhaps the worst crime of modern medical so-called science is the increasingly effective suppression of acute illnesses. Usually successful suppression has one of four consequences. The sufferer is killed. A foundation is laid for chronic and often incurable disease. Nature, if she can, will after a period of intervals stage more of these would-be spring cleanings or healing crises. Nature may effect a cure in spite of treatment, in which case the doctor will claim and probably get full credit for recovery. Dr. Williams thought it was a disgrace that people were told nothing can be done for them or that only expensive treatments could help them. Again, he emphasized that labeling someone with a diagnosis didn't actually help them recover, as it often resulted in passivity and outsourcing of health. As he would say, when you tell a patient the name of his disease, this fixes his mind on it, and that is the worst thing that can happen. He also pointed out that the medical system mistook all symptoms as disease, when they really indicated that the body was having a healing crisis. Doctors typically suppress symptoms with pharmaceuticals and sometimes surgery, but this can be a false treatment as it fails to address the underlying cause. He believed that the chief physical barriers to getting better were overeating, especially the wrong kinds of food, undereating of the right kinds, insufficient outdoor exercise, indulging in poisons like tobacco and alcohol. With those who resisted his dietary advice, he matter-of-factly stated, "You don't like the sound of it? Well, what of it? You can learn. After all, you've learned to abuse food. If you want body and mind to do their best, then give them the fuel the inventor designed and the quantities planned." He believed that disease is mostly a more or less gradual degenerative process, a consequence of failure to comply with the requirements of well-being. Recovery is mostly a more or less gradual regenerative process, a reward for recognizing and conforming to those requirements. However, he emphasized that of all the causes of disease and of all the reasons for not getting well, the psychological barriers are far and away the worst. He wrote, "So quit trying to get rid of your disabilities. They'll be taken away when you let their cause go. The life force within heals, sustains, provides, protects, and plans if we give it complete control." Dr. Williams wrote a few books, and his first was Hints on Healthy Living. We are fortunate to have a fourth edition, which was published in 1939, and it is one of our most treasured books. It describes what disease is, how it is brought about, and the problems of why many orthodox medical treatments don't help. He outlines the importance of fasting in acute illnesses and gives specific dietary advice for various health problems. Also included is over 100 pages of timeless recipes that he prescribed for his patients in his convalescent homes. Of course, the book is peppered with his uncompromising aphorisms, which epitomizes his no-nonsense style. Unfortunately, copies of the book are extremely difficult to find, so if anyone finds a source, please write it down in the comment section below. His advice remains just as relevant over 80 years later, and it has benefited my own family greatly, so I'm sure it can help yours. If you enjoyed this video, please visit supportdrsam.com